So welcome back. And last week, I attended the Digital Quality Summit in Boston with Michael Klotz. And like in years before, it was put on by NCQA and HL7. In addition to the keynotes and networking, there were basically 5 tracks, which are basically deep dives into the key topics of digital quality. I was in track 3, Mike was in track 1, which they actually came together by the end of the conference. And the track that I was in really focused on measure formats and terminology, and we'll get back to that in just a bit. But what I think is also very significant was the webinar that NCQA put on July 12th, just one day after our last episode that we posted and prior to the Digital Quality Summits. And I would highly recommend, if you haven't seen that webinar, to go out to the NCQA website and watch through that. So with me here today, as I mentioned, is Michael Klotz. And so Michael, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on what you think are some of those important announcements that came out of that webinar before we get into the Digital Quality Summit.
Sure. So I think 3 things stood out for me. One is the new schedule. So NCQA, I think, is doing a great thing by actually saying we're going to publish the measure specs ahead of the measure year. What that means is essentially that plans not only have the specs ready to when they actually need to measure retroactively, so to speak, like we do now, but also they have it ahead of the measure year, which means they can prepare and actually work on gap closures throughout the year and really think through how they want to measure and also plan for the HEDIS season for the measure year proactively. So this transition happens as of 2022, which means the specs for 2022 will be out in the second half of 2020. A related change is I think NCQA realizes there's a confusion about naming. So what they're doing is they're focusing essentially all the naming conventions in relative to the years on the measure year. So in other words, the specs are for measure year X, and the measure year is obviously measure year X, and also the reporting will be for that same measure year. So I think there's a lot of clarification and simplification on that. And third, NCQA is also saying that in designing new measures or updating measures, they're now going to really consider what they call starting with what's available at the source. So, and essentially, it's not just saying, hey, here's what we'd like to measure and find the data, however, wherever it may exist, but actually consider that, you know, for all intents and purposes, what's already available in EMRs as a pretty standard data set. And obviously that's a great baseline to simplify the digitization of quality going forward.
Yeah, and I would say that that one really is a key topic that was in track 3 at the conference. And as I mentioned at the outset, you're in track 1. Do you mind just sharing a little bit about track 1 before we jump into my takeaways?
I was in track 1, and that was really a technical track for all intents and purposes. It was about FHIR, the standard, and how it applies to quality measurements going forward, FHIR being the sort of de facto interoperability standard now for everything that has to do with clinical data, as pushed by CMS and ONC, but also widely adopted already by the technology community. But Reid, I want to hear more about what you saw in track 3.
Yeah, so track 3 was, the title of it was Measure Formats and Terminology. So I was interested in going to that track. I attended it last year as well, and this was aimed at focusing around the clinical quality language. And what I'd say essentially is translating measure specifications into the programming language CQL that's needed to implement these type of clinical or quality digital measures. And it was well attended. What was interesting to me is that this year compared to last year, obviously attendance was up, but there were a fair amount of health plan HEDIS people in the audience, as well as some of those HEDIS auditors. So I will say that the questions and comments at the outset initially, before we got really into the technical side, were very, very, I'll say, spirited, with my air quotes here, which were very good, I think, to hear. And I think, you know, NCQA and others in the room were good at understanding and listening to those and recognizing them. But my real takeaway from those conversations and just how the session started off and getting into more of those operationalization pieces for health plans is really what I interpret as a knowledge gap and really a technical implementation gap that we're all faced with. So with that, I decided that it'd probably be good for me to spend the random amount of time at the conference really in the hallways, having the conversations, connecting with people and getting their insights and their thoughts and even their frustrations around this transition. I think we're all in agreement this is where we need to go. It's just a matter of how we get there. And that's where knowing with what we know through our research that we've done, Michael and I, we know where this is going. We know the challenges of the past paradigm, or actually what's the current paradigm. And I'd say it really does seem that we are well equipped to support the different stakeholders in navigating the ecosystem on advancing quality measurement to a digital paradigm. So, Michael, anything to add to that?
Not for today. I know we're planning to sort of dive a little deeper in a future session on, what all the pieces are on the table and how they're going to fit together. I'm already excited about talking about that, but I think we're good for today.
Okay, great. Yeah, I know we had a little extra time there and got into sharing kind of our thoughts on the Digital Quality Summit and some of those changes coming from NCQA. So hope you enjoyed it, and that's a wrap for today, and we'll see you next week.